He stayed like that for a long, quiet moment, leaning against the wall trying to get a hold of the million thoughts racing through his head. "You look pathetic," a familiar drawl cut in. Draco leaned against the adjacent wall, arms crossed, one eyebrow arched in that signature Malfoy way. His gray eyes were sharp, but not unkind. Mattheo didn't move, just let out a tired laugh. "Probably do. You gonna mope out here all night?" Draco asked. "Or are you coming inside, mate?" Mattheo cracked an eye open, giving him a lopsided smile. "Depends on how much you plan to make fun of me." "Depends on how much you're gonna deserve it," Draco replied, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Mattheo let out a snort. "Cheers, arsehole." Then, with a groan, he pushed himself off the wall. "Guess I'm coming in." "Good," Draco said, a note of concern slipping through his facade of nonchalance. "Because honestly, mate, you look like crap." Mattheo shot him a dark look. "Thanks for that. What can I say? I'm an honest friend." Draco smirked. "Plus, the girls do love a tortured hero." Mattheo rolled his eyes, shoving him lightly. "Sod off." Draco just laughed, following him into the common room. "I'm just saying, the dramatic brooding thing's gotta boost your appeal by at least a few points." "Yeah, you're a damn expert on romance, aren't you?" Mattheo shot back, dropping onto one of the leather couches. "More than any of the rest of you losers," Draco retorted smoothly, lounging into an armchair. "And you need the extra points, mate. You're looking rough." "Thanks," Mattheo said dryly. "You sure know how to boost a guy's confidence." "Hey, what are friends for?" Draco replied, grinning. "Besides, I'm just telling the truth. You're a mess." Mattheo grumbled something under his breath, reaching up to run a hand through his hair. "Why are you here anyway?" "Couldn't sleep," Draco said with a shrug. "Figured I'd find you here, moping in some dark corner." "I was not moping," Mattheo muttered, crossing his arms. Sure, Draco chuckled. "You were sulking, brooding, wallowing in your own misery. Whatever you want to call it." "So, how did things go with Scarlet?" Draco asked. Mattheo glanced at Draco, really looked at him, for the first time since he'd walked in. The smirk was still there, but underneath it, something real. Genuine concern. He let out a slow breath and dropped his head back against the couch. "I don't know, mate," he said quietly. His fingers twitched at his side like they still remembered the feel of her hand in his. "She cried," he added after a beat, the words scraping raw against his throat. "And honestly, that was worse than any hex you could have thrown me." Draco was quiet for a moment, taking that in. He'd never seen Mattheo like this. Unguarded, vulnerable, torn up in a way that was more than just surface deep. It was more than simple heartbreak. This went all the way into his soul. "But she didn't say no," he said finally. "Not a question, not really." He knew the answer. And from the way Mattheo's eyes flicked up to his, he did too. It was like a gut punch, the truth of it. It didn't matter that she was upset. She hadn't said no. Hell, she'd still held his hand. Just for a few moments, but long enough to make his heart do stupid things. It was hope. Tiny, fragile, almost too fragile to hold on to. But god damn it, he was gonna cling to it anyway. "No," he said, his voice rough. "She didn't." Draco watched him, really watched him, for a few heartbeats. Then, to Mattheo's surprise, he didn't make another joke. "Then that's something," he said simply. It took a moment for the words to really sink in. But when they did, "Yeah," Mattheo said quietly, "yeah, it is." They sat there in comfortable silence for a while, the low hum of the fireplace the only sound in the room. It was still dark outside, and the rest of the common room was quiet. Everyone else was sleeping. "You should get some rest," Draco said finally, pushing to his feet. "Looks like you need about 12 hours of it." Mattheo rolled his eyes, but there was no real annoyance in it. "To talk, you look like you need beauty sleep more than I do." Draco gave a scoff and a grin. "Please, I'm naturally devastatingly handsome. A few less hours of sleep would do nothing to change that." "Your ego truly knows no bounds," Mattheo replied, rolling his eyes again. "One day it's going to be the death of you. You know that." "Death by beauty?" "I could think of worse ways to go," Draco said, tossing a pillow at Mattheo's head before moving toward his dorm. "Sweet dreams, you emotional wreck." Mattheo caught the pillow and flung it back, badly. It missed entirely and landed on the floor with a soft thud. "Rude," he called after him. Draco just laughed as he disappeared down the hall. Mattheo stayed where he was for another minute, staring into the dying embers of the fire. Then quietly, soft enough that only he could hear, "I'm gonna make it right." Mattheo lay in his bed, staring up at the dark ceiling. His body was exhausted. He could feel the heaviness right down to the bone, but sleep wasn't coming. His mind was too restless, too tangled up in 1,000 thoughts all at once. Memories of the night, those last few words echoing over and over in his head. I'm going to make it right. He turned over, burying his face in his pillow, with a muttered curse. It was no use. He knew it was going to be a long night. The minutes ticked by in silence. Every so often, the soft snore of another student drifted in from across the dorm, but for the most part, the room was quiet as a tomb. Mattheo shifted again, trying to get comfortable, but it was useless. Every time he closed his eyes, all he saw was her face. Her eyes, red from crying. I'm going to make it right. Finally, he gave up. Tossing aside the blankets, he swung his legs over the edge of the bed. Mattheo sat on the edge of his bed for a long moment, running his hands through his hair. Then he grabbed a jumper and quietly slipped out of the dorm, heading toward the Slytherin common room. The common room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of dying embers in the fireplace. He moved to one of the low leather couches and dropped onto it with a sigh. Pulling his knees up slightly, he rested his arms on them and stared into the dark shadows dancing across the stone walls. His thoughts drifted inevitably back to her, to them, to everything he'd thrown away and everything he was trying so damn hard to get back. I won't mess this up again, he whispered into the silence. Not again. He sat there for what felt like hours, staring into the fire. He lost track of time, lost track of everything but the thoughts running wild in his head. It was late. Everyone else was asleep, and he was alone, sitting in the middle of the common room, watching embers smolder and wishing, more than anything, that he was with her instead. He'd give just about anything, in that moment, to have her in the room with him. Damn it, he whispered. Damn it, I miss you. He leaned back and closed his eyes, but the image of her was still there, clear as daylight. Her laugh, the way she'd look at him when he said something stupid and knew it, the warmth of her hand in his. He swallowed hard against the ache in his chest. I love you, he whispered again, into the silence, into the firelight, like saying it might make a difference now. And for a moment, just one fragile heartbeat, it felt like she heard him. He opened his eyes again, blinking into the dimness. Wishful thinking, he muttered to himself, resting his head back against the leather. He let out a sigh that bordered on a groan. Part of him wanted to go back upstairs, to give in and try to sleep again. Mattheo's head snapped up, a mix of surprise and irritation crossing his face. Pansy, he said flatly, what are you doing up? He pushed himself upright, straightening his jumper. Shouldn't you be in bed? He added. It's late. Pansy stepped closer, her expression unreadable in the dim light. She wore a silk dressing gown, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. I could say the same for you, she replied coolly. Though I suppose brooding suits you these days. Her voice was sharp, too knowing, and it scraped against Mattheo's nerves like sandpaper. He didn't answer right away, just watched her with guarded eyes as she moved to sit across from him, one leg tucked beneath her. The silence stretched between them, tense and thick with everything they weren't saying. Finally, Mattheo leaned back again, crossing his arms over his chest. What do you want, Pansy? He asked bluntly. She studied him a moment, studied the shadows under his eyes, the set of his jaw, and something like a smirk touched her lips. I heard a rumor. Mattheo's eyes narrowed. About? Pansy tilted her head slightly, a lock of dark hair falling over one shoulder. You and her. She didn't need to say Scarlett's name. The way she said her was venomous enough. Mattheo remained still, but something in his chest tightened. And? He asked quietly, voice flat. Pansy tilted her head again, watching him with a mocking edge. And it's a little hard to believe, to be honest. Mattheo's fingers dug into the leather of the couch, but he kept his voice steady. Why's that? Because, she said, her voice low and deliberate, I don't believe you actually care. She leaned forward slightly, elbows on her knees. You used to joke about how all relationships were temporary, that people like us, Slytherins, we don't do forever. You said love was just a distraction. Her eyes narrowed. So why now, all this brooding, these grand confessions? She scoffed softly. Feels more like guilt than love to me. Every word was a dagger, and he felt every one. Because she wasn't wrong. He had said all those things. Hell, he'd used to laugh about it. About being forever single and all the girls he'd hook up with in the meantime. And now he was a goddamned hypocrite, falling hard for the one girl he wasn't supposed to. But he'd be damned if he admitted any of that to Pansy. You don't know what you're talking about, he said through gritted teeth. Oh. Her head tilted again. So you never said those things then? Never told me that relationships were pointless and love was overrated? Never bragged about being forever single because serious attachments weren't worth the hassle? She raised an eyebrow. Funny. Because I have a pretty good memory. Mattheo clenched his jaw. Yeah, I said those things, he admitted quietly. I was an idiot. He looked at her, then really looked at her, not with anger, not even resentment, just a quiet sadness. Back then, I believed it all. Thought love was weakness, that caring too much made you vulnerable. His fingers curled into fists on his lap. Then she happened. The words were barely more than a whisper, but Pansy heard them, and her smirk widened. Right, she said, her voice a cool purr. And now, suddenly, you're in love. She sat up straight, her hands folding neatly in her lap. You'll forgive me if I have a hard time believing it. Wrong. You think this is love? She pressed. Or just regret? Maybe guilt? Her voice softened just slightly, no longer mocking, but curious now. Which one is it, Mattheo? Which one keeps you awake at night? The silence stretched. Mattheo stared into the dying embers of the fire, his reflection flickering in its dim glow. Finally, he spoke, low and raw and so quiet it barely seemed real. It's both. Pansy blinked, clearly not expecting that answer. He turned to her then, eyes tired but clear. I am scared, he admitted, terrified, his fingers curled against his knees. Of not being enough for her, of losing her again. He swallowed hard. But I don't regret loving her, he said, voice firming with every word. I regret betraying her. His chest rose and fell unevenly. I regret running when things got real instead of facing them like a man. He looked at Pansy then, no anger, just honesty. And yeah, I feel guilty as hell for hurting someone so good-hearted just because I was too afraid to believe she'd choose me over everything else. Another beat, then, but this isn't about guilt or fear anymore. His gaze dropped back to the fire, to flames that were small now but still burning stubbornly through the dark. This is about love, he said softly. Real love, the kind that changes you. And finally, if I hadn't felt it, if she hadn't made me feel it, none of this would hurt nearly as much. I spent years telling myself love was weak because I didn't want to feel weak. Because letting someone in, that's terrifying, and I've always run from things that scare me. His voice lowered. But Scarlett, she didn't ask me to be fearless. She asked me to be honest, to be real. He let out a slow breath, and when she walked away, it wasn't just my heart that broke. His fingers curled slightly against his knees. It was my whole damn world. Another beat passed before he added, I thought being free meant never having to answer to anyone, to float through life on charm and jokes and quick escapes. A dry laugh escaped him. Turns out true freedom isn't running away. He met her eyes then, steady, unflinching. It's staying, even when it hurts. And finally, she made me want to stay. Pansy studied him for another quiet moment. You do know, she said slowly, that she might not give you another chance, right? The word sank like a stone into Mattheo's chest. I know, he said quietly. I know I might be too late. I know I did permanent damage. He glanced at the fire. But I have to be man enough to own up to it, even if she tells me no. Pansy nodded, satisfied. She turned to leave, then she was gone. The common room echoed quiet again, only the pop and crackle of the fire breaking the silence. Mattheo sat there a few moments more, staring into the flickering embers. Pansy was right about a lot of things. He'd been arrogant, reckless, cocky to a fault. He'd never had to work for a girl's love before. But damn, he was willing to work for this one. It was nearly 2 a.m. by the time he finally made his way up the stairs to the dorms. The castle was eerily silent, even the portraits snoring in their frames. Mattheo moved quietly down the corridor, footsteps barely making a sound on the stone floor. He could see the light filtering out under the Slytherin boys' common room door. He hesitated for a moment, hand resting on the door handle. Then, with a deep breath, he pushed it open. The common room was still dimly lit, just enough to cast long shadows across the armchairs and couches. 2 figures were sitting by the fireplace, voices quiet and low. They looked up at the sound of the door creaking open. Lorenzo raised a lazy eyebrow. Look, who decided to show up? Mattheo tried for a grin, but it felt forced. Yeah, he said, raking a hand through his hair. Laugh it up. Theo glanced up from his book, peering over the rim of his glasses. Long night? He asked, voice dry. You could say that, Mattheo said wryly, dropping into a chair. What are you two still doing up, anyway? Lorenzo stretched languidly, arms behind his head. We were waiting for you, of course. Mattheo raised an eyebrow. And why's that? He asked. Theo turned a page, his expression unreadable. Because we like to know when our friend is about to either destroy himself or finally grow a spine. Lorenzo smirked. Seems like it was both. Theo leaned back in his chair, eyeing him thoughtfully. You hurt Scarlet. You screwed up. Bad. There's no denying that. Mattheo's chest ached at the words, but he didn't argue. He knew it was true. But, Theo continued, you at least recognize that, right? You understand that you need to do more than just apologize. Of course, Mattheo said quietly. I know I have to actually prove how sorry I am. Lorenzo shifted in his seat, arms folded. Good, he said, because apologies mean nothing without change. Mattheo nodded. I know that now, he admitted, voice quieter than before. I'm not just saying the right words. I mean them. But you need to show her that too, Theo pressed. Words are easy, he continued. It's action that matters. Mattheo knew it was right, but hearing it aloud still stung. How? He asked quietly. How the hell am I supposed to prove I'm serious about this? Theo gave him a look like that was the dumbest question he's ever heard. By showing her you're willing to put in the work, he said bluntly, by being the person she thought you were. Mattheo ran a hand through his hair again, a frustrated sound escaping him. Easier said than done, he grumbled. Then stop making excuses, Lorenzo said flatly. Mattheo's head snapped toward him. I'm not. Yes, you are. Lorenzo leaned forward, voice calm but firm. You've spent your whole life avoiding real emotional weight. You flirt when you're nervous, joke when you're scared, run when it gets hard. He held Mattheo's gaze. Now, no more running. The silence that followed was thick, charged with truth. Then, if you want to prove it, Lorenzo said quietly, start by being present. Not charming, not funny, not reckless. His voice dropped to a near whisper. Just honest. Mattheo was silent for a moment, letting the words sink in. He knew Lorenzo was right about all of it. He wasn't used to being held accountable for his bullshit, but maybe he needed it. You're ruthless tonight, Mattheo said with a huff of dry laughter. Lorenzo just smirked. Only because you need the wake-up call. Theo chuckled softly. Well, you always were his reality check. Lorenzo grinned, unashamed. Mattheo rolled his eyes, but there was no real heat to it. He knew his friends were just looking out for him, even if it stung to hear. You know, I'm sitting right here, he muttered. Theo smirked. Yeah, and you need the reminder. Mattheo shook his head, but there was no real annoyance in it now, just a reluctant acceptance. He leaned back in the chair, arms crossed over his chest. Fine, he said quietly. No more running. The words felt heavy as they left his mouth, like a vow. Lorenzo and Theo exchanged another look, not smug, not teasing, just satisfied. It wasn't approval, it was belief. And somehow, that meant more. Theo closed his book with a soft snap and stood. Good, he said simply. Now go to bed, you emotional disaster. You look like shite. Lorenzo chuckled as Mattheo scowled at him. And wear something decent tomorrow, Lorenzo added lazily, pushing up from his seat. If you're trying to win her back, don't show up in wrinkled robes and dragonhide boots. Mattheo shot him a glare. I always look good in dragonhide boots, he protested. Theo rolled his eyes, already heading toward the stairs. Whatever you have to tell yourself, idiot, he said over his shoulder. Lorenzo followed suit, pausing halfway to the stairs. Oh, and Mattheo? Mattheo looked up, eyebrow cocked. What? You might want to shower too. Mattheo's mouth dropped open. Are you saying I stink? Lorenzo shrugged, smirk tugging at his lips. Just a suggestion. Then he and Theo disappeared up the stairs, leaving Mattheo sputtering after them. Bloody hell, he muttered, scrubbing a hand down his face. I hate my friends. He sat there a moment longer, the room suddenly much quieter without Theo and Lorenzo's banter. Mattheo let out a long, slow exhale. He knew they were right. Tomorrow, he'd start trying. He'd be honest, present, real as his dragonhide boots. He let out a quiet snort. God damn it, he said quietly to the empty common room.